large extent, I'm just going to be repeating what Kirsten said, because we want you to be aware that our records are more than just Queensland. They are Australian and to some extent British. We even through Ancestry and Find My Past have overseas records. And the other point we would make, and Kirsten made very effectively, is even to find Queensland records, you need to look elsewhere. We also want to look at the problems and techniques of finding the elusive arrivals. And here we're going to look at the Female Middle Class Immigration Society. For those of you who may not be aware, we have something called the Australian Joint Copying Project. These are records from Britain which are of direct relevance to Australia. They're the original documents. We've got 7,000 or so reels upstairs. Now, the main body of those records is from the National Archives in the UK, previously known as the Public Record Office. But in addition to that, there are a lot of private institutions which have contributed to those records, and they are flagged by an M, or the Miscellaneous series. You can see what the booklet looks like here, and it's organised a great deal more simply than some of the other archival records. But when we go into that booklet, it tells us that the Female Middle Class Immigration Society was founded in 1862 by Maria Rye and Jane Lewin to help unemployed educated women to emigrate to find suitable jobs. They didn't just come to Australia, they went to the other colonies as well. And it refers you to another entry that may be relevant. These are basically poor women who don't want to lose social class. Therefore, they don't want to work as servants in England. It's less humiliating if they come to Australia. Now, here's Maria Rye, who started life as a copy clerk, copying records for lawyers. And in 1865, she travelled to those ports trying to make sure that these distressed gentlewomen were being looked after appropriately. So who were these women? First time I heard about it was when someone, at an afternoon tea in the middle of a talk said, what was a Miss Rye emigrant? And it set us looking. They were mainly lower middle class women. They could become governesses or superior servants, because even servants have social class. You wanted to be a superior one. Daughters of clerks and professionals earning upwards of £150 a year. They needed but couldn't get employment that was suitable for them. And as Maria Rye described them, they were distressed gentlewomen. But she was also interested in the needy working class. And you know that a lot of people who were poor were considered unworthy. They were seen as lazy. But then there's this wonderful group known as the needy working class. So why were these women in such a pickle? Well, firstly, men didn't want to marry impoverished women. They were also emigrating, they were marrying later, and of course if women couldn't support themselves, they were in a mess. The other thing, of course, is that it was not really socially respectable to be working. Idleness was the proper role of women. So obviously if they were going to work, they'd need to go elsewhere. And of course in the days when we all hear about how important it is to get superannuation, there were a lot of middle class men who were not adequately insured. So when they died, as we saw in the case of Maud and Wright, their children were destitute, like George, who went into an asylum for those who moved in a more superior station in life, or they came out hoping to earn money quickly as minors. Also, female education was quite inadequate for the time. So these were the women who were caught in the crossfire of this social change. They needed work, but they didn't want to be humiliated. So why come to the colonies? Obviously, social class was going to be less of an issue. And also, gentlewomen travelling alone, how hazardous does it get? So this was certainly something to consider. And naturally, people were going to be critical. What are you doing coming to the colonies? Convicts, depravity, prostitution. You know, it was not considered a wonderful thing to do. Lack of facilities, even when they came here, it was, you know, there was not adequate reception facilities for women. And they weren't eligible for a free passage. The governments wanted hard-working domestic servants. And when they were coming to Queensland in 1862 on the Conway, Miss Rye managed to swing some deal whereby they came as domestic servants. And the papers were absolutely ruthless. What was going to happen when, you know, their money ran out and they'd run up all these bills. These women get off the ship and they're just seen as idle wastrels, looking for husband hunting. And, you know, they were already condemned before they arrived. The other thing is, in Australia, we tend to send people to schools, and we did in the 19th century. So there weren't as many jobs for governesses as there were in England. And obviously this new emigration society was a marriage bureau, and it was seen as placing governesses. Now, who's going to want to marry a woman of social pretension who may not be used to any hard work, who's going to be basically, as many would see, useless as a governess? The other thing is those who most desperately needed the help of this society were not pioneers. You know, they were used to living discreetly, poorly in a home of their own. And women of 40 were considered too old to adapt. In some cases it was even said 30 or 35, but of course we wouldn't even like to consider that today. Since many of us are doing it many years later, relentlessly. Now, the female middle class immigration society why is it of interest to us? What sort of value will it give to us about finding out about women at this time? You know, finding out about women in immigration records is a nightmare. Well, first of all, they had to take out a loan. Now, to come out on an immigrant journey was really very humiliating. You really needed to come as a cabin passenger. We noticed, as Kirsten pointed out, most of the rights came, even if it was just steerage, they paid their own way, except for one who was a remittance passenger. Most of them were steerage. There's a sort of a social class thing there. And also you're stuck in the in-between decks and it would be just so smelly and so unpleasant. And the people you'd have to mix with. Like our ancestors. So what these people did was they took out loans with the Female Middle Class Immigration Society. Now, it was not going to be easy for them, so they would send letters giving us some idea of what it was like for them when they arrived or why they couldn't repay their loans. One of the most common questions we get was, well, what was it like when they arrived? How did they fare? We know when we're looking for stories of immigrants, we're only picking them up some years after they arrive. So these letters tell us what it was like for them. They've written these letters, and I've actually got 3 pages. Our volunteers, in case you haven't worked it out, our unit's kept very much afloat with volunteers. And one of our volunteers indexed the names of those ladies who wrote the letters, and we have 3 pages of them. And we'll talk a little bit about what they wrote later. But they provide a valuable insight into those experiences and to the life of those times. And of course to women, who it's very difficult to find information on. Now, you're probably not going to be able to see this, but this is one of the records, and it's reproduced in some of the books, about what happened to the first 51 immigrants. And it doesn't read like a totally successful situation. Had failed entirely to obtain employment in England from inability to teach music. The climate caused severe headaches, which may have affected her success. Married directly and returned to England. It does give you the impression it was a marriage bureau. I'm only just reading from this sort of quite randomly. In Africa, obtained a situation shortly, very comfortable and happy. obtained a situation with a family returning to India. So you can see that it records people in Australia and Africa, Canada, New Zealand. There are numbers of books which take these records into consideration as well. We gave a whole talk on the Miss Rye immigrants once, and there was this huge group of people. Has anyone heard of the author Patricia Shaw? She wrote a book on two ladies. It's a fictional book, Orchid Bay, which was about the female middle class immigration society, fictionally, and of course all the fan club came. Amazing who you attract. Well, what about these distressed gentlewomen in Queensland? Well, firstly, Eliza Bernard came on the Conway in 1862. She didn't have much luck, but she went to the famous Tithe family in Sydney. They had a lot of interests, and of course we would mainly know them from their brewery interests. Maria Atherton came out on the Young Australia in 1862. She wrote about what it was like on the Young Australia, but eventually she went to the US. Note they're not staying in Queensland too much. Agnes McQueen came out on the Light of the Age. She sold drawings and she kept house for her brother. And Hannah Wilson came out. Her husband was already here and her daughter ran a school. And she kept writing saying how difficult it was for her to make the payments. And of course, 65, 66, there was an economic downturn. Now, how do we know some of the ships that these people came on? We know about the Conway because there is a list, no more than a name and an age and a domestic servant. That was where Maria Rye managed to swing it as domestic servants. We know about Maria Atherton on the Young Australia because she wrote about it. But the other two, Agnes and Hannah, we need to go to state archives to look at their land orders. Now, this can be an important way of finding what ship when there are no lists. Doesn't always work, but in the case of Agnes McQueen and Hannah Wilson, it did. A lot of people sold those land orders. It was like a voucher entitling you to get so much land. After a couple of years, you were entitled to more land. So obviously, because not everybody would have been strictly honest about it, they needed to keep a record of the ship of arrival. So that can be a way of locating where people, which ship they came in on.
Is that everybody was given land orders?
No, the paying passengers were given them. Although, look, it also varied over time as well. But that index is at State Archives. And of course, the people on the Lady Bowen would have got land orders. Which brings us to the AJCP Miscellaneous series. These are the records that are not from the Public Record Office, now more recently known as the National Archives. And they include manuscripts in the British Isles relating to Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific. We have material that's relevant to Queensland. The National Library has material from a much wider collection. As anyone who was at the GSQ conference would know, it was emphasised how underused they are. It can be extremely difficult to locate material, but the miscellaneous series is much easier. As you can see, it includes material from libraries, county record offices, local authorities, businesses, churches, obviously learned societies and institutions, such as the British Immigration Society, private individuals, and even from Dutch and German authorities, because obviously they have colonies in Australia and the Pacific. It's numbered and preceded by M. So if you're looking for an M, a miscellaneous series film, you won't go to the straight run of them, and they are, as you walk into the microphone room, you'll be looking for a number with an M in front of it, and they are filed after the Public Record Office or National Archives reels. And the handbook tells you exactly which film to go to, and the entries are arranged numerically. Now let's get on to the one that is probably our greatest source of frustration, the Irish. And And if you go to Ireland, I can notice everybody immediately starts to become alert to this one because we're all trying to find them. They will tell you over in Ireland that the best records are in Australia. That's after you've decided, well, I can't find them here, I'll head off to Ireland. But we've got records here in the way of births, deaths and marriages, which are virtually like mini biographies, and they're often our best clue. Also the whole range of notices, and Kirsten emphasised this, there's a huge range of notices in newspapers. Funerals, magisterial inquiries, accident reports, little historical items that might be linked to the development of a town or a region, and shipping lists sometimes. Cemetery records can take it, especially the burial register or headstone. Family records, you know, those Bibles and letters and travel diaries, which we're all hoping to uncover. Hospital records. Kirsten pointed out we couldn't find George Wright, and of course he used his, sometimes he was George Alfred, sometimes George Alfred Carthew, but mostly George Wright. We couldn't find him till we got that important clue about the Makara, and we could place him in the 1890s. Found that through a hospital record, and they are at State Archives. You can't rely on just one institution. Inquests for immigrants can also give you that information. Pioneer registers, where information is collected on a region and families are put together, sometimes with documents and photographs. Mind you, they can also get it very wrong, but we won't go into that. As well as local records. Then we get to the Irish records, like Griffith's valuation, a major valuation of land which happened post-famine, 1848 to 1864. The Tithe Applotment books, this is where people were being surveyed to pay a tax to the established church in Ireland, the Church of Ireland, and even Presbyterians and Catholics paid. They were able to find common cause in objecting to it. Also townlands, and of course, what is a townland? It's the smallest division of land. The name townland comes from a poor translation of an Irish word, and it can be in the middle of nowhere with nothing, and it's still a townland. It's their smallest unit. Maps can help, they can also drive you mad. Church and civil records of births, baptisms, marriages and deaths. This is a local record we've got here in Brisbane. In 1865, Father Devitt did a census of the parishioners of Fortitude Valley. And the beauty of this is, because it's 1865, and as Kirsten emphasised, we're furiously trying to find anything we can on the 1860s, but with the Irish, who we always have difficulty with at the best of times, if they're in Brisbane, and Fortitude Valley is a huge parish, we might pick them up here. And it's wonderful that the little notes that Father Devitt made. Mrs. Gill, husband, a Protestant. Mrs. Sullivan, living with the above, not married. We've got Catherine Deering with Mrs. Looks like Ratbuck to me, at Bowen Park, and John Buckley and wife with Mrs. Maynes boiling down works. So there are a number of people there, and you know, sometimes that can just be the clue that finding that window of arrival, that you can start narrowing it down. That is one record. Not hugely helpful, but helpful, especially if they came in before 1865. Looking at a death certificate. Now, these are all the things that you've got to deal with, and just trying to deal with them can consume a lot of energy. Laura Ryan was in fact Honora Ryan, also known as Nora Ryan. So the first name is wrong. She lived at John Street, which is now Rotherham Street. So you have to look up an index of street name changes. Of course, I don't know the mother, and you'd think that might be unusual, but it's not. When we go down the certificate, and this is, as you can see, it's giving information on 3 generations. We're getting information on her husband, her parents, or her father at least, and her children. Michael Ryan, we get his name and address, so that is another way of checking we've got the right person. There are only about 100 Michael Ryans at any one time. 4 of them died in 1 year alone. Someone asked me the other day, I'm trying to find someone who changed their name from Riley to Ryan. What are my chances of finding this Michael Ryan? Well, you know, you need a lot of patience. You need to do all that cross-checking that Kirsten emphasised. Okay, she was buried at Toowong, so that immediately tells you there's a headstone to look at. And what's good about that is that it tells you she's Honora Ryan. Born where Tipperary? Well, what's the most common name in Tipperary? Ryan. So that's not giving us the key bit of information. But it does give us one useful information. 31 years in Queensland. Now, not 30, not 35, there was a tendency to say about. 31, and that was exactly correct down to the month. So that was important in locating this family. It also gives you the names of the husband and the living children. The husband, of course, is David Ryan, and the children. You can see that 5 of them had already died. A number of those, I think 2 of them had died in Queensland, but, you know, most of them had died before they came. But just that pattern of naming in the ages is helpful. However, the funeral notice, this isn't being given to the government. This is the audience for the funeral notice is their family. And what is the area with which the Irish identify? Their parish and their townland. With a name like Ryan, you need the townland. Because if you look at some of the records, not only is the last name the same first name is repeated endlessly. So you've got to sort of narrow it down to the smallest unit. Now this, of course, is misspelt. It says Ballygurteen. It's actually Ballygorteen. I won't tell you what that required to find that. The parish of Kilmoyla. This is the Catholic parish, not the civil parish. This can drive you mad as well, and sometimes the Catholic and civil parish are the same. But you've got a clue, Ballygorteen, Kilmoyla. So when we went to a travel diary, which was found after, you know, someone died, you could then find out how Ballygorteen was spelled, because this grandson went to visit them in Ballygorteen and went to the Kilmoyla church. Important point. When you are searching for the records of Moreton Bay before 1860, go to New South Wales. Very often the records may be missing in Queensland. They are there in New South Wales. I had some lady coming to me, she said, the 1850s record of the Lady McDonald's missing, would you at least have a picture of the ship? And I said, hang on, the very best records of the Lady McDonald are here, but they're to be found in New South Wales. Now, these Ryans did the right thing and came in before 1859. Now, Kirsten has set up our web pages so that you can go straight into where you need to go. So if you go to State Records of New South, it'll connect you to the online indexes, because that's what people want. The major indexes that you're going to need to find shipping will be archival. National, obviously New South Wales, Queensland, and as Kirsten said, Victoria. And what Charlie's tried to do is to, where it's relevant to Queensland, bring the records that these bodies have together in a list that is both alphabetical and chronological. So that if you can't find them in a particular time, you can at least look at the ships that came in and see where lists are missing. But then, of course, that doesn't take in the people who've changed their names and other dreadful things. But note that Kirsten's also set it up so there are brief guides and a catalogue search. So this is quite a valuable way to go into those records. When we get to assisted immigrants, and even though Kirsten was talking about unassisted, it starts, to actually get in there, to actually locate the place, you tend to go into these assisted. Now you can of course pay for $6 a copy, or you could come and have a look at it on film, or you could look at it on Ancestry. But what it has there, which you really need to be aware of, is Moreton Bay 1848 to 59. But you also need to be aware of Sydney and Newcastle, because what would happen is they couldn't find employment for them, so they'd stick them on a boat and send them up to Moreton Bay. In 1850, 300 people who arrived in Sydney were sent up to Moreton Bay. So yes, look at Moreton Bay, but also look at Sydney, even if they came to Moreton Bay. Now with Ryan, the issue is how do you identify the least common name? Kirsten said when we're looking for somebody like Arabella, and we get the pattern that they are travelling in 2 or 3, and of course you would have no refined young lady travelling alone. We have a look by the least common name, which in the case of that group of rights coming out was Reginald. Once we started looking for Reginald, we found the other two, including Arabella. So David Ryan is the least common name, and I know we've all got David Ryans, but it's still the least common. So we put it into Moreton Bay, just his name, to try and get a clue how many there are. And there's another one, only 2. What a relief. They came out on the ship together, and family. Now David Ryan said he was 42, he was well into his 60s. But who's going to give a free passage to an old bloke in his 60s? Remember, not too many people even live to that age. So he trimmed it back because 40 was the age that they were actually considered to be appropriate. And of course all of his kids had to trim their ages back as well, didn't they? So a lot of people would look at that and say, can't be him, wrong age. Well, when it comes to occupation and age, things aren't too good in Ireland. In 1852, we've had the famine and there's the reorganisation of land. People are what they need to be to get out here. So we know that they came to Moreton Bay, we know they came on the Argyle in 52. We go back to the index, get rid of David, we put in the name of the ship because we want all the rhymes on the Argyle. And lo and behold, there's much more than this family, isn't there? We've got, 3 Johns, 2 Marys, the usual sort of thing. So we've somehow got to find the family group. And when we go to have a look at the Argyle, and note that this is incorrect, it says Sydney, it was Moreton Bay. These people were probably hoping to go to Sydney. After all, Honora Ryan, had a sister in New South Wales, but of course the gold rushes had happened at the end of 1851. And the Colonial Secretary didn't think he should be sending people to Sydney just to go exploring for gold, especially when the government was paying. So they sent them up to northern New South Wales. So although there's hardly any ships arriving until 1852, like you've got in 1848 December the Artemisia, and in 1850 the Emigrant, and then in 1851 the Duchess of Northumberland, but 1852, apart from the German ships, 9 of them are in. And here we see the list, and this is why it's better to look in New South Wales and Queensland. It tells us his parents, Edmund and Margaret, both dead, Honora, Edward and somebody Curry, both dead, the writer Edward and Margaret, both dead. See, it's the way they abbreviate can be frustrating as well. And then all the children. His parents are David and Honora, that's these people above, and so on. He was well into his 20s, by the way, but he had to trim his age back. There are 2... A lot. A lot about their ages, about their names, about their occupations. I love this beautiful innocence. We spend our whole lives getting around these crystallised. Now there are two records for New South. There is the agents list and there is the board list. The agents list is much clearer, but it's got less information. When you can't find things out, it's a good list to look at. It doesn't have the names of the parents, but at least you can read it. So it's worthwhile remembering two lists. You're not going to get names of parents in place of origin in Queensland, generally. Sometimes you might get the names of where they came from, but as Kirsten was showing you, very often it's no more than a name, sometimes not even an age. But New South Wales, assisted, not unassisted, and assisted means any sort of private or government payment to get here, that will be a really good way to find it. Okay, now with the Irish, there's a whole agony of land organisation, and there are books which cover that. There are plenty of them up there in the library, and you'll find plenty of it on the net. And of course you've got systems that are overlaid. So you've got counties, baronies, poor law unions, and the Catholic and civil parishes are different. Not always, but just enough to confuse you. And the townland, which is the main address you need. And where do these rhymes come from? Well, we know from other records of the children, they say Bancha, and that's the town. Sometimes they say Tipperary. We know it's in the southern part of Tipperary, and we know that it's from Kilmoyla, the parish of Kilmoyla, which also, of course, there's a townland Kilmoyla. So it's down this way somewhere. Kilmoyla, south of Bancha, and the Irish will give a town, or they'll give a townland, or they'll give a parish, and you don't always know which they're talking about. But there is this wonderful little thing which Kirsten has refreshed on our website, the IRA Atlas Townland Database. If we put in Ballygorteen, we want to know the parish, and we would prefer to find the barony and all the rest of it. When we put in Ballygorteen, surprise, surprise, there are two of them in Tipperary, except that from looking at the map, we know that it's in the South Riding, and the civil parish is Conbelow. Now, working these things out, I'm making it sound as if it's simple. For those of you who've done it, you think, can't they just sort the whole mess out, really? So the South Riding, in the civil parish of Conbelow, poor law unions, providence and everything. Now, we've got Griffith's valuation on fiche up there, and it can be sometimes a relief to go and look at it. But also ask about Ireland, and that address is in your notes. If you just put in Ryan and David and select from a list Tipperary South Riding, there he is. Now there's another David Ryan in that parish, but when we went in, we saw that he wasn't from the townland of Ballygorteen. When we go in, note the Catholic parish is Kilmoyla, but of course the civil parish is Conbelow. And there we see Ballygorteen, that's the one we're after, and we get maps references, and that's what we want to find out. And there is a townland map. You can see Bancha, and south of Bancha is the townland in Ballygorteen, and you can get maps that show you. He was 14 on that map. Of course the map split for Conbelow, but you can see it across there, but that's where the land was at that time. How long did that take to find that out? Well, years actually. The other thing I want to draw attention to, since you're always navigating all these problems, is that we have a number of religious newspapers like the Methodist Times and the Catholic Leader. The Presbyterian Church also has their archives, their own papers. What's good about them is that they pick up people from around the state. And so we see here a Bartholomew Foley. We couldn't find him, the family had been looking for 10 years. The Catholic Leader, and we're actually getting a talk on this fellow, and it's becoming a bit stressful because we're trying to show the Tithe Applotment books, and we can't find when he's arriving. I'm just trying to do a bit quiet, please. Here it tells us here that he arrived in Rockhampton in 1883. And of course there's a whole lot of other things that could give us leads there, like for example, family members and whatever. So those obituaries, whether they're in religious papers or whatever, can be helpful. But Rockhampton takes you to the Rocky Morning Bulletin, and it tells us that he came to Queensland in the Wahroonga in 1883. So what are we going to do? We're going to go to the Wahroonga Rockhampton list for 1883. There was only one arrival of the Wahroonga in 1883. Now when those BISN ships were coming down the coast, and Queensland had a contract that they would deliver the mail and passengers every fortnight, they'd stop at the different ports. And the list is under the port, so we just have to go to the list for Rockhampton. Now I've obviously done a bit of a collage here. There's the Wahroonga coming from Plymouth, Rockhampton free, in other words he's an assisted immigrant, assisted remittance, all of these things mean the same thing. And Bartholomew Foley was known as Bat Foley, but obviously whether they misheard it or simply anticipated that it was Pat, he's recorded as Pat Foley, 22. But note that there's not a lot of information on those Queensland lists. If you can pick them up pre-1859 in Moreton Bay, it's a bonus. So we then go and check. Note again, I know we keep emphasising this, all the various indexes that State Archives has. And we go into these assisted immigration records. We're mainly only interested in it from 1860 on. It provides direct access to the digital copies. You can go to the list. Now you have to search for the page though. So you would take note of the date and the page, because it will come up at the first page so that you've got the details of the list. If there are several lists, it may well be an earlier journey of that ship, and you've got to go through looking for the date and the page. Another thing to be aware of, how else can we find where they came in? Well, indexes. We're looking for Duns coming in on the Star of Brunswick in 1865, and we're told it's on Bill 2140. What about on Ancestry? Couldn't find them at all on Ancestry. So finally just put in the year, the name of the ship, went through the whole list to find out that Dun had become Dumel. Glanahilty, I don't even know how you pronounce that. Rhodey Dun actually came from Coolanummunna. And Ms. Domel, the baby, was born on the ship, so she certainly wasn't from Glanahilty. Beware with Ancestry. As fantastic it can be as picking up things you never think of, don't always trust the indexing. So here's the list. There's Rhodey, he was a groom, he was from Coolanummunna. Mary was from Glanahilty, and the female infant, Ms, was actually born on board. A reminder that we keep emphasising, you can get the information guides online, and that's where they are. We've also got immigration guides, getting started in more than lists. We put a couple of them out there. We've got Charlie's list, which is forever working on, but we've got an older version of it at the moment out in the reading room, and he has organised them alphabetically and also by the ship's date of arrival. So when you know that possible window of arrival, you can look at the ships that came in that time. Finding a birthplace in Ireland, always a nightmare. Here's Hannah Skinner, said she's from Baltimore, Cork. Let's look at her birth certificate. It's in the district of Tulla, Registrar's district of Skibbereen, and then there's this area here. And when I talked to someone who was Irish, and I said, what's this NATH or RATH or whatever it is? She said she was from Baltimore. And if you've ever dealt with the Irish, who are very used to everything in Ireland, they look at you as if, what's wrong with you? And say, that's Rath, Ramor. And you think, yeah, I don't get it. However, the parish is Tulla, and that both the civil and the church parish is Tulla, and the registration district based around the town is Skibbereen. Here we are, there's Baltimore there, the village, there's Rathmore 6 miles out of it, and there is the town of Skibbereen. You need to often go to maps to make sense of it, and mercifully some are online. We've also got some. But can you see what you are up against? What on earth are they talking about? Now, Familysearch can be helpful, only occasionally, but there she is recorded there as her birth, 20th of March 1870, and they even got the parents' names right, William Skinner and Mary Shipsey. And there it is. There's no image available. However, Irish Genealogy, and the address for that is in your list, allows you to look at the church records. And they're not just Catholic, they are also, as you will see there, other church records as well, such as Church of Ireland, and of course there are some Presbyterian ones. But you need to know that she comes from Rath, and to see Rath and Rath in the islands. And it's the diocese of Cork and Ross, because if you look outside that, it can be almost impossible. If you go, however, to Cork and Ross and you look at those two, you have a chance of finding her. Now, what's quite annoying about this is that she was baptised as Joanna. And when she died and they looked for a record, they found a Joanna. Her son put it on the headstone, and of course the usual rows ensue in this family. If you click on the blue, you go to the actual register. And there she is, Joanna, parents William Skinner, Mary Shipsey, witnesses James Driscoll and Margaret Collins, all the names of that part. And you can go to the Tithe Applotment books to the Skinners, and there they are in Lower Rath, they don't seem to worry. And that is her grandfather's brother, and there we can find out how much he was paying for land to the Church of Ireland, or being at least valued at. And this is the other question. We know there's huge movements between Scotland and Ireland in both directions, England and Wales to Ireland. Well, there were no official records. This is probably, now the Skinners were from Cornwall. They would originally be good chapel-going people, boat builders in Cornwall, but they moved over sometime in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. We're never going to find that record because it's probably as formal as that, getting in a boat and deciding to stay at some point. This is one of the paintings from that part, from Cornwall to Skibbereen, off to Skibbereen. Some books that you might find useful: Irish Research by Trevor McLaughlin. Okay, doesn't want to move. Barefoot and Pregnant, which he's also written. There are 2 volumes of works, and that's mainly looking at the the poverty-stricken ladies who came out after the famine, feisty Moreton Bay women. And John Brennan, who goes county by county, and the records which are available for each county. That's the sort of thing that he does. Gives you the list. That's county down. So immigrants arrived in Australia under different schemes. They could be poor, but they'd struggle to pay their own way, even if they had to take out loans like the Female Middle-Class Immigration Society. What makes those ladies distinctive is we've got records of their arrival. Anyone leaving, don't forget to fill out your feedback form. They arrived in 1860s, those ladies, many missing lists. We can pick some of them up via their letters and via land orders. Their letters outline what it was like for a woman trying to struggle to earn a living. And of course they're not just for Australia, Canada, Africa and so on. With the Irish, the arrival and the place of origin is problematic. Is there anyone for whom that's news? Pre-1859 New South Wales lists definitely prefer them if your family came in at that time. And just remember that when the Irish are talking about their origins, it could be a county, a town, a village, or a townland. And they're difficult to deal with because they are just so inconsistent.